welcome to all. This is Clem Beazold, co-founder of the Public Sector Foresight Network. And I want to welcome you to this joint PSFN, Association of Professional Futurists webinar with OECD on foresight in government, particularly asking about how foresight works with helping governments recover and reinvent post-COVID-19, and as we'll see in future trends and technologies towards net zero. We're featuring Duncan Cass-Beggs and Alana Markle from the OECD Strategic Foresight Unit. And Nancy, would you describe PSFN?
Thank you, Clem. This is Nancy Donovan. I'm the other co-founder of the Public Sector Foresight Network. This is a group of several hundred around the world, which was formed after a breakfast meeting Dr. Beazold and I held in 2011 in Vancouver, Canada, at a meeting of the World Future Society to determine interest by government foresight practitioners and whether we should develop a critical mass to meet on a regular basis. Well, there was a great deal of interest by that group of 90, and beginning in 2011, 2012, we have been holding annual meetings and covering issues that relate to the purpose of the Public Sector Foresight Network. What are leading examples of foresight in government around the world? The methods used, what are the challenges and opportunities in doing foresight for the public sector, as well as how to best sustain these activities and communicate information to policy and decision makers. We're very excited to co-host this webinar with the Association of Professional Futurists, and this will be an absolutely excellent presentation by our OECD colleagues, Duncan Cass-Beggs and Alana Markle. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. And on behalf of the Association of Professional Futurists, my name is Rebecca Ryan. I'm on the APF board. I'm also the treasurer, a thankless job, but one that's so important. It's my pleasure to join Clem and Nancy and members of the Public Sector Foresight Network in this important conversation, not only because of the work that Duncan and Alana have done with this OECD project, which my network has found value from, but also because it's a lonely job doing foresight, and especially in the public sector. So to be able to bring these two organizations together to talk about public sector foresight feels more relevant now than ever before, as our public sector is being asked to do more in the near term and think harder about the long term. So on behalf of the Association of Professional Futurists, we thank you, Clem and Nancy, for your partnership. And Duncan and Alana, we cannot wait to hear what you have to share with us and how we can share with you. Back over to you, Clem.
Okay, thanks. So today we've asked Duncan and Alana to speak, in effect, from OECD of their work in foresight, and particularly recent important projects. The OECD is an international organization that works on establishing evidence-based international standards and finding solutions to a range of social and economic problems. As such, the OECD is one of the world's largest and most reliable sources of comparable statistical, economic, and social data. And OECD produces and promotes foresight. The OECD Strategic Foresight Unit works with many governments and organizations, as well as bringing foresight to OECD projects and research, and preparing the OECD itself for the future. In this context, we've asked the Duncan and Alana to consider the report that they did a year ago now on strategic foresight for the COVID-19 crisis and beyond, using futures thinking to design better public policies, as well as to address other major current work they're doing. Duncan Cass-Beggs is the counselor for strategic foresight at the OECD, with a mandate to help strengthen strategic foresight and innovative approaches across the OECD and bring a stronger future focus to global dialogue on key policy issues. This involves working closely with the OECD staff, national governments, and leading foresight practitioners worldwide to explore disruptive changes that could occur in the future and their implications for policy decisions today. The aim of this is to challenge prevailing assumptions and stimulate ongoing dialogue on the most adaptive policies for a rapidly evolving and uncertain world. Duncan came to the OECD in 2016 from one of the best national foresight program units in the world, which is Policy Horizons Canada, where he served as the director of strategic foresight. Alana Markle is a strategic foresight analyst with OECD, where she uses futures, processes, and analysis and storytelling to derive practical implications for policy. Before joining OECD, Alana conducted research for a variety of organizations, including the Institute for Security Studies in South Africa and the Pardee Center for International Futures at the University of Denver. And Alana is a recipient of a major award in our foresight field, and that is the School of International Futures Young Futurist Award, their next generation foresight leader award, and which Alana received in 2019. Duncan, Alana, you're on.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Clem, and thanks to the whole team and all of you assembled. It's really a great honor and a delight to be able to be here with all of you from the AFN and the APF and PSFN. And I think it's really helpful at a time when we're all being sort of pushed really hard on foresight and being spread a little thin, that we really make the time to come together like this and share understanding and compare notes. We do a bit of this as well at the OECD and realize how much work it is. So I just want to thank you again for making that happen. And I think it's crucial that we find the ways to keep coming together and finding ways to collaborate and learn from each other. So I want to do really three things with today's presentation. We're going to first start by just going over a little bit of who we are and what we're doing. But then we're going to look at two main projects. First, we're going to look back at as Clem requested, to a piece that we did in the spring of 2020 and then published in June 2020, which was looking at how to use foresight to inform the COVID pandemic and the recovery. Then we're going to shift to a current project, which is looking at the use of foresight for successful net zero transitions. Now, in both cases, we're not going to really focus on the substance, although we're happy to come back to that in discussion. But we're sort of more looking at the meta point of the approach of how one actually uses strategic foresight to raise understanding about uncertainty and guide policymakers in applying that in their policy decision-making process. So go to the next slide. The OECD, as Clem mentioned, is a global policy forum operating out of Paris. And within that, we are a strategic foresight unit based in the Secretary General's office. And our role is really to strengthen strategic foresight within the OECD's own analysis across the organization and its multiple directorates. Also to work with governments and public sector strategic foresight units around the world. And finally, to bring foresight to inform global dialogue on key global policy issues. So the OECD has got a fairly decentralized foresight practice where a number of the directorates will conduct foresight projects and publish studies in their own particular fields. And what we're going to talk to you about today are the couple of cross-cutting projects that we lead, where we draw on expertise from across different OECD directorates and also from various countries and non-government strategic foresight practitioners to try and bring these together on really important cross-cutting issues where we can all benefit from sort of some collaboration and economies of scale on foresight. Okay. So as you all know, strategic foresight is really above all an approach to think systematically about the future to inform decision-making today, recognizing the inevitable uncertainties that we face in the world. It's not about making predictions or forecasts, but rather about exploring and preparing for alternative plausible futures, and of course, doing it together. The participatory dimension is central to effective foresight. So next, we'd say that our our view, our mantra on strategic foresight is really that, particularly in a time of very high uncertainty and rapid change, strategic foresight is not a luxury. It's a core piece of due diligence of responsible policymaking. And really, when we boil it down, there are many techniques and tools and approaches involved. Of course, I'm sure you're all very familiar with them. But we boil it down when we're communicating this to public policymakers to really an essential 3 points, which is first, that importance of actually making the time to engage proactively with the future, even when there are lots of pressures to not do so. But secondly, that's not enough. One has to actually then push oneself to look beyond the expected future, to imagine and prepare for the unexpected. And then thirdly, of course, bringing that back into our decisions today about designing adaptive and forward-looking strategies. And with that, I'm going to ask Alana to take us through the first of the two reports.
Great, thanks, Duncan. It's great to be here. Thank you again for the invitation. So I'll speak first about, just to give you a little bit of context about the report, and then I'm going to highlight a few features of that report that we think help contribute to making it relevant and useful for governments as they were navigating kind of pandemic environment of high uncertainty. So it is a relatively short paper. We produced it as part of the OECD's broader policy response to the pandemic on its dedicated COVID-19 resource hub. And overall, we were pretty happy with its stats. So it's gotten over 10,000 downloads since its release, which is pretty good. So the piece, it begins with 3 high-level scenarios on the direction of the pandemic itself. But we also recognize that policymakers and policy analysis community also needed to move beyond thinking about the direct health situation and the economic consequences of lockdowns. So also looking at uncertainties regarding the broader spectrum of kind of more medium-term potential implications. And we look at that across the STEEG spectrum. I'm sure many of you use STEEG or STEEP or STEEP-V. So we use society, technology, economy, environment, and governance in our work as a rule. So this takes the form of a collection of uncertainties and possible developments that could unfold under each, and then concludes with a guide on how to use these to host kind of participatory dialogues around the uncertainties. And finally, it includes a bibliography of other foresight pieces that were coming out around this time. The first feature I'd like to highlight is kind of a meta point, I suppose, about this paper being an invitation to lean into uncertainty. So it came out relatively early in the pandemic in June, when the fact that we were living in this kind of uncertain context was not coming as a surprise to people. It was widely understood, and really all kinds of new possibilities were emerging and very present in people's minds. So what we tried to do with this piece was kind of invite people to lean into this uncertainty with us by using futures thinking, rather than to avoid it by making assumptions, even if those were different assumptions than they might have had before the pandemic started. So practically, this meant doing a lot of more show than tell, to kind of enter into dialogue with people about what they were seeing and experiencing. And this included hosting engagements like workshops and scanning club meetings with OECD colleagues up to kind of senior level of directors and senior management, down to kind of interns and across the analysis community, and then also our government foresight community. So we were collecting a lot of information from the folks we were interacting with on our own scanning, and then taking that and doing the kind of sense making and putting it into a structure that could generate insights rather than anxieties. So the second feature to highlight is that we were really prioritizing producing something that was easy to digest and globally relevant. So as an international organization, we serve our members, but we also serve the broader global community. And we were producing a public good, a public product, but we wanted to make sure that it was really accessible in the sense of being relevant and practical, not just free to download. So I think it's safe to say that kind of wide significance and broad applicability were high priorities when we were selecting the content to include in the piece, perhaps more so than novelty, which may not always be the kind of standard for a Foresight product, but I think it was appropriate under these circumstances. So for example, one area of uncertainty we look at, one of the C categories under the area of society looks at issues around civic space and social attitudes, how those might evolve, how people's movements might change through migration and urbanization patterns. And then we cover a range of other issues under other categories. So this brings me to the final feature to highlight, which is that one thing this piece doesn't do is offer recommendations. So what it does try to do is provide kind of guidance on how one might arrive at better, or at least more kind of futures informed or future conscious decisions. And practically this meant including kind of a simple guide on how to expand on the content, how to kind of generate your own ideas and produce insights for one's own context. So the main points of this guide being kind of creating or taking, a small collection of the what ifs from the piece. Like, for example, what if the proportion of population living in a major urban center falls significantly over the next decade? And then identifying one's own signals to support the plausibility of this, to kind of solidify it in one's mind. And then explore the consequences. So looking at second, third, even fourth order impacts that could arise. So, in this example, if the urban population drops significantly, there could be a wave of rural gentrification that leads to a rise in homelessness in rural areas. And then finally, looping back to implications. So implications and potential consequences for policy. So looking at how affordable housing policy could become more of a challenge in small cities as a result of the pandemic, and unused urban spaces needing to be able to be retooled and kind of reapportioned for different uses efficiently. And then finally, of course, looping back to actions in the present. So for example, looking at how zoning laws could prevent spaces from being repurposed. So that's kind of an example of how this could be used. And I guess the bottom line is just to point out that, this was designed as a Foresight product that really wasn't meant to sit on a shelf. No good Foresight product should, because the insights and the value really comes from using it. So I think when it comes to Foresight helping governments recover and reinvent themselves, it's really a high priority to make the contents of Foresight products something that people can feel empowered to pick up and use and generate their own insight from, and hopefully options for action. And just to illustrate this, I would like to point out that neither of the two graphics we've used in this presentation were something we produced. These are things that we found in other work. So the first one was from the European Trade Union Institute, from a report I kind of happened upon that had kind of taken our paper and adopted it and used it to look at futures for EU economic governance. And then the second one was from a professor who sent it through to us. So we felt like that was a nice endorsement of the way we like to see our products, having new life breathed into them in different kind of policy spaces. And that concludes it for me. Back to you, Duncan.
Okay, thanks very much, Elena. So that was the whirlwind tour through the COVID piece. But now I want to change pace a little bit and take you into a current project, which you'll see has some similarities. So this is our project about using strategic foresight to inform successful net zero transitions. So the context for this is, as I'm sure you know, that governments and organizations around the world are right now adopting ambitious commitments to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And this raises the question, well, how do we ensure that these strategies that are needing to be designed today are actually going to be successful in this face of very high uncertainty and rapidly changing conditions that we're likely to see over the period of their implementation? So we asked ourselves, how can strategic foresight best contribute to what is arguably this most crucial current global public policy priority? And what we've identified is that we can use strategic foresight to attempt to expand awareness of the possible future changes or disruptions in the 2030 to 2050 period, and the new opportunities and challenges that these could bring for net zero transition strategies. So if we go to the next slide, I'll show you just a little bit of how we're beginning to approach this. So the first step is really we began by identifying 30 initial possible disruptions that could occur over the 2030 to 50 period that could have significant implications for the implementation of net zero transition strategies. Each of these disruptions represent a plausible extreme of one key uncertainty. In a way, they're like mini scenarios. Each one generally represents just one direction of change, and we do this for the benefit of simplicity when workshopping them. So we've identified these essentially by STIG categories, and they include societal changes such as mass adoption of various forms of human augmentation and shifts in social values, technological changes such as a significant move towards virtual work and virtual living, or thereby lessening the ties of geography. We've also created a special category on green tech disruptions in particular for this project. So this would include game-changing breakthroughs in solar radiation management, energy storage, carbon capture, but also the opposite extreme, where some of these technologies may fail to materialize to the extent that governments are currently counting on. Many of you have probably heard John Kerry and others have said that potentially half of the global emissions reductions that we need to see will be dependent on technologies that have yet to be invented. And we reduce a lot of these technologies sort of in the wings, but we also need to realize that this is not guaranteed. And so that's a potential scenario to be preparing for as well. What would we have to do if we couldn't count on all of these developments? So then we actually move into including environmental disruptions, which may seem circular, but it's not, because what we're realizing is that actual net zero transition strategies that are primarily aimed at mitigation are going to be having to take place in a world where we could see fairly dramatic environmental changes to the physical environment itself over the immediate decades. We've long past now the idea that we'd be safe until sort of the second half of the century to see those changes, as we saw in the summer of 2021 already with heat waves and floods. This is ramping up very quickly now, and we could find ourselves in the coming years and decades having significant physical environmental changes that are impacting on our ability to carry through on our net zero transition strategies. So here we're looking at everything from heat waves, sea level rise, biodiversity loss, but also this sort of combined scenario of a multiple combined cascading tipping points and ecological collapse that we capture in what we're calling the hothouse Earth scenario. So we then include some of the key possible transformations to the economy, including such things as a highly decentralized blockchain-enabled economy and a general shift to replace growth in consumption with growth in well-being as a primary measure of societal progress, and others, recognizing that economics right now, and we see this a lot at the OECD too, is a domain that is highly in flux, and that a number of the world's leading economists and central bankers are admitting that the economy is not working entirely as economics has expected. And there's really tremendous amount more uncertainty about the future of the economy now than I think would have been accepted by mainstream economists, as recently as 10 years ago. So, and finally, we look at possible disruptions to national and global governance, including the splintering of the global system into either bipolar or multipolar parallel clusters with increasing geopolitical rivalry, or a growing dominance of technology companies in the governance space. So of course, there are many more, and we're in the process of refining the list, both to see what we're missing and also what could be combined if they lead to similar directions. And I want to point out that these are fairly mainstream disruptions. These are probably not going to shock or stretch the credulity of policymakers, but they seem like the right place to start. However, we do also want to gradually build out and include a few more really out there plausible disruptions that could serve to stretch our thinking even further. Eventually, we aim to collaborate with various partners around the world to actually develop 2-pagers on many of these to supplement our toolkit. So, of course, we don't make any pretense, however, of these being at all comprehensive in covering the vast range of possible changes or disruptions that could occur. The real purpose of this is to make the larger point about the need to consider uncertainty and possible disruptive changes and to design policies in a way that's going to be agile and responsive to that. So I'll just begin with one example. Now, this is we held some preliminary workshops this summer. And one message that came out really loudly from it, that won't be news to you, but it was surprising to me just how sort of strong a conclusion it was. And this is really that this is really based on the hothouse Earth scenario that I mentioned earlier, which is becoming, unfortunately, increasingly plausible. And this was really the point that vigorous and proactive adaptation strategies may be needed in order to prevent societal collapse and ensure well-being while maintaining progress on mitigation. That really we need this in order to be ensuring the ongoing societal support and cohesion that will be needed to be successful in our mitigation strategies. It's a little bit like flying an airplane through a hurricane while simultaneously repairing the engines and patching cracks in the hull. And if we don't plan now for successful adaptation to heat waves, food shortages, refugees flows, floods, we'll see these crises overwhelming our capability and our political resolve to continue with the necessary emissions reductions efforts. So therefore, we need to really look for the synergies between adaptation and mitigation efforts so that they're mutually reinforcing. And then another point that came out is really the potential need to research and test solar radiation management techniques so that they're ready as short-term last resort strategies. So obviously there's a lot of reason for concern about some of these strategies, but it seemed that we'd be better placed to have tested and know what works and what the dangers are, and rather than to find ourselves suddenly facing tremendous public and political pressure to do something immediately and actually not knowing what the potential impacts of these could be. So, and then Alana is going to run us through a couple more of the initial insights that have come up from the summer.
Yeah, sure, thanks. So a few other ones I'll highlight are in the kind of intersection between technology and society. So examples about human augmentation. So kind of questions around whether the physical and cognitive limits, whether those will, the physical and cognitive limits of the human body will stay the same. And the kind of question about what if cognitive therapies raise the threshold in intrinsic cognitive capacity and become available to at least some members of the population in most countries. So some kind of initial implications coming out are it being easier for people to enter and leave formal employment, at least skilled employment, throughout their life, and this potentially creating a kind of a lifelong learning career flexibility model that could open up new opportunities for people to be really active in environmental reclamation, for example, through kind of public works programs. Also looking at the issue of cybersecurity, in particular, cyber slowdown. So what if cyber attacks are kind of carried out enough and increase to the extent that they overwhelm kind of cyber defenses to the degree that no digital space is really safe and innovation becomes more analog. And systems are kind of disconnected, making innovations in mitigation pathways less compatible and therefore slower. So decarbonization really being much more localized and relying on reduced consumption. And finally, thinking about the extent to which the economy, work, and human life move into the kind of digital and virtual space. So thinking about what if the physical world interactions we have with nature and other people are significant, but only a kind of relatively small percentage of how we use our time. So this kind of work from anywhere model enabling mass migration to areas with high quality of life and lower cost of living ratios, which creates the risk of increased mobility, again, affecting rural areas in potentially problematic ways like threatening habitat, and conservation initiatives, creating rural gentrification, but also opportunities, of course, to harness these technologies to provide well-being improvements that offset some of the sacrifices required for decarbonization.
Okay, well, thanks, Alana. So I've just got 3 last slides and I'll move them fairly quickly. But just so in terms of next steps, we're working to refine and expand this Foresight toolkit. And then we aim to test it and pilot it with a number of governments and organizations. And just to give you a sense of how we hope to use this is that the idea would be that the multiple disruptions that we will have described and cascaded out and done a bit of interaction and cross-impacting between as well, we will serve as a sort of initial ingredient, and that what partners would do would be take a pair of the disruptions and combine them, maybe take 3 pairs and combine them and turn those into 3 different scenarios and build those into sort of more complete, rich, multi-dimensional systemic scenarios. And so we think this is aiming to strike that sweet spot where what we're providing is sort of the initial support, the initial ideas that they can build from, but then whereby the participants themselves take ownership of the actual design of the scenarios and applying them to and tailoring them to their sort of local circumstances, of course. And then we go through a number of other steps that bring this through to, what are the actual actions for reinforcing or adjusting their net zero transition strategies, stress testing their strategies if they are already in place. So then we intend to continue the dissemination and the refinement as part of ongoing efforts to strengthen foresight for net zero and beyond. So in terms of potential areas of collaboration, I would first mention that we would be very interested to hear from you about your latest and greatest foresight work in any area, really, because as you've seen, we've gone very broad in terms of what are the potential changes over the coming decades that could be relevant for net zero. And we are going to be trying to stretch that into some of the sort of even the less mainstream and more provocative exploration of future scenarios in that period. So we would welcome any suggestions that you might have that would be valuable to this project. Secondly, we'd ask you to invite you to join us in some of the workshops we'll be hosting, or alternatively to host your own workshops, and we'd be happy to share the materials in order to explore the implications of the disruptions for net zero strategies. That's our next step, is really trying to ask ourselves which of these disruptions have the greatest salience and which are the ones that we therefore need to dig into and look at more, and as we're selecting the ultimate ones to include in the toolkit. And then, of course, there's piloting the toolkit itself, or a similar concept, even within your government, your organization, clients, and networks, and so forth. And then I think more broadly, we want to think and we want to hear from others in terms of how do we link this effort with other efforts that are aiming to use strategic foresight to really inform a successful and just net zero transition, as well as informing other similar emerging, applying foresight to other emerging global risks. Okay, and then finally, I can get my slide down to there we go. So just a few questions maybe to leave with you. What do you think of this approach to applying foresight to support the net zero transition? What do you see as its strengths, but also weaknesses that we should maybe be anticipating and addressing? What do you see it? How do you see it as linking with your other efforts? How could this support or connect with your work? And how can we best work together in global foresight efforts to support successful just transitions to a net zero world? So thanks very much.
Thank you, Duncan. Thank you, Alana. These questions are excellent starter questions, and you may notice in the chat that Nicole, who is our super supporter, the assistant to the board of the Association for Professional Futurists, she's added the questions in the chat because here's what we'd like to do next. Each of you are going to go into a group that is hopefully broken between PSFN members and APF members so that we have a combination. We'd love to strengthen the cohesion and the bonds between us as part of what we're doing here today. So if you haven't already renamed yourself put an asterisk if you're an APF member and an underscore if you're a PSFN member. That'll help us mix the groups in a way that you're going to make some important connections here. So we've got 20 minutes for this, and we invite you to take the first half of those 20 minutes, first 10 minutes, to get to know each other. Where in the world are you? What are you working on? And to spend the second half of your time together discussing those 3 questions that Duncan just posted on his PowerPoint and Nicole has added to the chat. I do invite one of you, somebody who's good with working in a Word document or a Google document, to scribe out any questions that emerge from your group that you would like Duncan or Alana to take on when we come back from our 20-minute session. Are there any questions before we go into our breakouts? All right, thank you so much for renaming yourselves. Nicole, when you're ready, send us to our rooms. On behalf of the Association of Professional Futurists, I would just want to thank the Public Sector Foresight Network for joining forces for this. Of course, I want to thank Duncan and Alana for their presentation and so graciously responding to so many of our questions. There have been questions about whether the recording is going to be available. Yes, it will. There have been questions about, do we need to form a task force? I'm not sure. But what is true, what feels absolutely true to me is I think all of us, excuse me, that was just a frog in my throat. All of us feel reassured that we are not in this alone, that there are people around the world who care about the big issues facing humanity, and opportunities like this to come together around the campfire and warm our hands around these common questions are critical. So you haven't heard the end of APF and PSFN working together, and we'd like to hear from you about the comments or the conversations you would like to have in the future. Clem, to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Rebecca, and thanks to the APF team for its great orchestration of this. And as you see on the screen, this is one place where we'd welcome sending suggestions to Nancy Donovan for future topics in conversations like this. And her email is there. We'll send that out as well, again, with the links to the posting of the material from this meeting. So I'd like to, in closing then again, thank Duncan and Alana for their presentation, but also the immense body of work that the OECD group does and its contribution. And this was for me, a fantastic discussion of that, as well as thank all of the attendees, including many friends who I have not seen in a while. So thank you, and take care. We'll be back again.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
I enjoyed
everyone.
everyone's comments.
Thanks.
Thank you, Clem. Thank you, Rebecca. And especially thank you, Duncan and Alana.